We're going to do an example of a high voltage termination kit. This one's a 3M cold shrink end termination kit that you would use indoors. It doesn't have the stress cones on it, so that's how we can easily tell this is a indoor kit. We've got a 1/0 copper foil shield cable here, so I'll be stripping this out and showing each step here. So the important thing is to always read your instructions really carefully. It's got step-by-step instructions for each type of cable that you might end up doing. So one of the most important steps is to figure out exactly how much of this cable we have to actually strip. So there's actually a handy chart in the back here. So it tells you we've got foil shield cable. So we're going to strip 9 inches plus whatever our lug length is. And I've already pre-measured this lug length. We need 1.5 inches plus 1/8 of an inch for expansion. So, all right, so I'm gonna start stripping our cable. And the amount of outer jacket we have to strip is going to be 10 5/8 inches. So I'm gonna mark it out, and then I'm going to take my X-Acto knife and I'm just gonna score around the outer jacket of the cable on my mark line. And remember, there's a copper foil inside here, so we don't want to go too deep and score that copper coil or copper foil, because that's what we're going to need later to connect to our ground system. So I've gently scored that with my X-Acto knife, and then I'm going to use my dull Nip-X knife in order to actually strip the jacket, because it's a little easier to run along the outer edge of the cable. And I'm going to run that right to my mark. And now our jacket should just tear right off. And we can see our copper foil inside here now. And I'm going to refer back to our instruction sheet. It says 1.5 inches of copper foil and then 1.5 inches of semicon. So I'll mark those out right now. Inch and a half for the copper foil, and I'll just ring this right around with my Sharpie, because it's going to be a lot easier to cut it after I unwrap it. Now this copper foil is extremely sharp, so you want to be really careful. Should maybe be using gloves right now, but just unwrap it, taking care not to get your fingers on any of the sharp bits. And when I get close to my mark, I'm just going to be really careful not to tear it, because we actually need this little section intact. And I'll use some scissors just to cut right through this foil on my mark. And then we can just wrap it right back around. All right, so we've got our copper foil here stripped back 1.5 inches, and we've just got to get our copper tape over that edge so it doesn't have a sharp edge anymore. So we put one full layer and then overlap it just a little bit. And I'll just give it a little twist to make sure it's all tight still. And now we're ready to mark our semicon and start scoring it. So I'll measure, we've got to be 3 inches from our outer jacket strip length to our semicon edge. Leave a little mark here. And now we're going to use our semicon scorer. We've got our semicon scorer here, and we've got our depth gauge here that we can adjust. So turning this dial will give you different depths that you need. And we want to just barely score almost through the semicon, but not completely through. If you go completely through, you're going to actually start cutting into the insulation, and we don't want those track marks for our electricity to pass through, obviously, right? So we're going to make sure, I've already adjusted this to our depth that we need, and it's got a little gauge here to tell us exactly where we're at as well. And on the inside here, you can maybe just make out the blade, so it's barely cutting into that semicon. We've also got a square cut and a spiral cut, so I'll do a square cut in order of ring all the way around the cable, and then I'll adjust it to spiral, and it'll actually spiral off the cable, and then we can unwrap it. So, and you can see we've got a couple marks here as well. The right hand side of our tool always goes towards the end of the cable. So I'll just crank this, and that's going to spread our jaws on our tool. And I'll just line up the mark on the tool with the mark on our cable. And I'll bring it down until it comes tight, and then give it an extra little quarter turn. And before I start ringing, I always double check and make sure it's actually in square cut, because we want to go all the way around the cable and then start spiraling. So now we can wrap it using just gentle pressure, right? Let the tool do its job. Once we've gone around plus a little bit, we'll change it to spiral cut. And while it's spiral cutting, it's going to want to try to pull itself off of the cable, so you just want to make sure it's square to the cable the whole time we're pulling it. So you can actually just apply pressure on the tip of the tool, but I usually just hold it right tight to the base so that I make sure it's actually clamping right tight to the cable. Once it starts trying to twist off of the cable, it's gonna leave shallower marks in the cable as well, so it'll make it harder to actually remove the semicon later. You can score your semicon with a knife, but if you go too deep, you'll have to do a lot of sanding later, so this tool usually manages to avoid that as long as you set it up properly. And now I'm going to just watch the end of the cable and see right where that blade comes out of the semicon, because that's where I'm going to have to start actually tearing it. And I don't know if you can see, but there's actually little spirals all the way around the cable now. So that's what we're going to be tearing off. So I'll take my X-Acto knife and I'll just score a little deeper just to get started. We're going to remove this insulation layer underneath anyways, so it doesn't matter if we cut into it right now. And I'll get in there with my butter knife and just pry out the semicon to get started. Now that it's started, as long as my tool was adjusted to the right depth, it should just tear off in one piece, hopefully. And I'll always pull about a half turn around the cable and then re-grab it. When you start pulling it like this, it's going to tear right close to the cable, and then you got to get some pliers out and start tearing again. So and once it gets a little out of hand, you can always just trim it back so we're not fighting with it. And I can tell we're getting close, so I'm just going to watch it and make sure it does a nice ring cut. And I'll just rotate the cable around and inspect it for any sharp edges in the semiconductor. And it looks pretty good. If there's any little nubs sticking out, you're going to want to take your knife and just trim those off. We don't want any sharp edges on the corner of that semiconductor. So now we can see our insulation layer underneath here. So we'll be ready to remove this as well. So I'll refer back to our instruction sheet, and we need to remove 1 5/8 inches of our insulation layer in order to accommodate this lug. So I've got our insulation stripper set up here already. Got this handle here, we'll loosen it so that we can adjust it to tighten on the cable. And then we've got the blade inside here. So. And adjusting this dial will actually change our blade depth. So I've already got it set up, but when you want to adjust your blade, make sure you've removed all the semicon so it actually clamps right on the insulation. And then we'll clamp it down onto our insulation. You can actually see the blade is right up to the copper depth here. So if it's looking like it's going to actually cut into the copper, you just turn it back, turn it forward a bit, and if you need to go deeper, you turn it back. Okay. And this tool also has a square cut and a spiral cut. So when you want to spiral cut, you'll loosen off this thumb screw, set it to the spiral cut. If you've got a really stiff material for your insulation, you can actually adjust the spiral so it's less pitch, and it'll just take a lot less insulation at a time, but it's also not going to be trying to like rip through the insulation. This insulation is nice and soft, so we can go full spiral cut. And we also need to know when we're going to stop our tool, right? So a nice trick for this is we've got our blade right tight to the end of our cable. So now the back side of our tool just has to come back 1 5/8 inches. So I'll leave a tape mark for myself there. Make sure the blade's still tight to the conductor. And we'll leave a tape mark at 1 5/8 inches. I'll leave a little tag there because this is obviously going to come off. And then when we're starting our strip, we're going to have to give the tool a little push towards the insulation so it gets started. And once it's actually cutting into the insulation, we should just have to turn the tool. And we're going to keep turning until we're just at our tape line. And then I'll crank it back just a little bit, maybe 15 degrees. And then I'll set it to square cut. And cranking it back just that little bit just takes the pressure off the blade so that you're not trying to change the pitch of that blade while it's actually digging in. And then we just go around one full turn plus a little bit. We can loosen our clamp off our insulation and then just pull off our stripper. And now our insulation just comes off in a little spiral there. Since this insulation's so soft, we can see it didn't do a perfect square cut, so I'll take my X-Acto knife and just trim it up a little bit usually. Make sure it looks nice. Okay, and our next step is going to be our ground braid. So it's really easy to skip a step once you've done several of these, so I always recommend just double checking through your instructions. Once you've missed a step, it's usually much harder to backtrack and try to fix it, so I definitely recommend, even if you've done it dozens of times, just read through the instructions again. So we've applied our wrap of copper foil already, we've prepped our cable, and now it's telling us to apply our mastic and our ground braid. So our mastic is just a sealant tape essentially. So it's got these white release liners here on either side, and this just prevents the mastic from sticking to anything inside our kits, right? It's extremely sticky, pretty much similar to what you'd use for sealing a roof. So you definitely want to not get it stuck to everything. And it says to apply our mastic 1/4 inch from this outer jacket edge. So, and it says to use light tension, so I'm going to apply some light tension so that it stretches just a little bit. And we want one full layer. So I'll go just over where we started so that it sticks, and then give it a cut. And I'll just take that mastic, it's soft, so I'll just squish it into where it overlapped and spread it out so that it's a nice even layer. Now that we've got our first layer of mastic applied, we can install our ground braid, and I'll actually install it this way. So we've got our solder block. It says to apply the solder block right onto the mastic. And that's so that these braids don't try to stick individually. It gives it a nice thick base to stick to. And I'll just press that right into the mastic. And then we can see the way this is folded, it's actually pushing it into the copper foil. So that's why I wrapped it this way. Our short braid end is actually going to get cut, and the long end is going to get grounded, or it's going to float on the other end. So we'll wrap it around, and I'll just mark it on a 45, and this is how we're actually going to cut our ground braid. So once we've cut it, it's actually going to lay right inside here. So I'll just cut it on a 45 here. And double check it. It looks pretty good. It's going to sit right inside there. And now we're going to apply our constant force spring. So our constant force spring has to actually go same direction as our ground braid, because we want it to cinch it tight down onto the foil. So I'm just grabbing it by the loop and pulling it, wrapping it around. And when you get to the last wrap, you can easily pinch your fingers there. So just try to keep that in mind when you're getting close to the end. And once it's wrapped itself over, I just give it a little twist and make sure it's tight. That's going to apply some constant pressure on this ground braid to our foil, and then it's going to make a really good connection. So next step, we're going to have to apply a layer of mastic over top of here. And what that's going to do is that's actually going to seal our cable, right? So from here up is going to be our cold shrink, and that's going to seal itself for us. So I'll take our mastic, give it a light stretch, and I'll just press it into our first layer of mastic. Once again, with light tension, wrap it around, and same as last time, one full layer. So we'll get to the point where we started. And I'll do the same thing. Just press it into the first layer, make sure it's nice and spread out among itself. And another step we have to do is we also need a marker for where to start our cold shrink. So the instructions here give us a measurement of 4.5 inches back from our semicon strip. So I'll leave a little mark here with my Sharpie. And then I'll actually apply a piece of vinyl electrical tape as well, so it's easy to see. This can also work as a phase indicator too, so I'll usually leave this tape on. So for BC Hydro, this would be their black or B phase. And double check our instructions. Our next step, we need to apply 2 highly stretched half lap layers of electrical tape around the mastic strip and constant force spring. And it has some important notes in there as well. It says to leave at least 1/4 inch of our ground braid exposed. So this cold shrink, when it's shrinks down onto our termination here, it actually does need to make contact with our ground braid the way it works. So we have to leave this 1/4 inch here as well when we leave our when we stretch our tape over. And we can also see this little bulge here. This is our high K layer. So that actually has to go right over top of the semiconductor. And we can see it's actually going to line up perfectly, so that's good. So we're going to take our electrical tape, and I'll start that with at least 1/4 inch gap here. I want to make sure it's covering the mastic really well, because if this mastic does push itself out, when we're pulling out our binder, it's actually going to bind on that mastic, and you may have to cut your cold shrink kit off. So we want 2 highly stretched half lap layers over top of this. So we should be able to stretch this tape to about 5/8 or half of its original thickness, and that'll make sure it's nice and tight around all our components here. And we want to go from the mastic just to our copper foil. We don't want to cover any of our semiconductor. We want as much of that exposed as possible, making contact with our kit. So I've done one layer, half lapped, and we'll just go back the opposite direction. And once we've done our last half lap layer, I'll just do one layer with no stretch. And what that's going to do is it's going to make sure we don't have that tail trying to stretch itself and pull itself back on our wrap. So we've got no stretch, and just wrap it around tightly. Give it a couple squeezes to make sure it's tight, and refer back to our instructions. Our next step is going to be to install our lug or connector. So we've got a compression lug here that we're going to install, and we can see we've got a little bit of extra room there for expansion. This isn't an aluminum lug, so it shouldn't expand too much, but you also don't want it to expand and hit our insulation. It'll actually some of the stiffer types of insulation will actually crack the insulation and ruin it. So you definitely don't want your lug to actually hit the insulation. So we've got a 1/0 conductor. So we've got these pink indicators showing that we need a pink dye. We'll take our lug, make sure it's bottomed out, and you always want to press from the tip end of our lug towards the insulation, because that's going to cause that expansion to go this way. Otherwise, we're going to have a void inside our lug. It's actually going to press a void through our lug. So we take our dies, and we just want to line them up between these indicator lines. So we're going to do 2 pressure crimps. And you just want to make sure that it's going to be nice and square and even with the lug. And you also want to make sure you don't pinch your fingers or thumb in here. Click indicates that we've done our pressure connection, and we'll just slide it in between the next 2 indicator lines. And now we can see we've got 2 pressure connections completed and evenly spaced between our indicator lines. So, and we can also see our conductor is still exposed, so it obviously hasn't hit our insulation. One important step we should have done before this, but I was pretty sure it's safe, is you want to make sure that this will actually slide over top of your lug. You may have to actually leave this on the opposite side of your cable, ready to slide up to your lug. This is a small lug, so I knew we were safe. Our next step should be cleaning and prepping our cable, and then we can actually install our cold shrink. So for cleaning and prepping our cable insulation, we've got these nice little sardine cans from 3M, and wrapped around these sardine cans and taped, you'll usually have some non-conductive sandpaper. So this insulation actually looks really good. We don't have any deep score lines. I'm actually running my fingers along. Can't feel any sharp edges or anything, but I'm still gonna prep it just in case. So just take your sandpaper, and you don't want to go deep or apply too much pressure. I'm just gently pulling it up and down, doing some flossing. And this will just make sure that we've got a nice even surface, spread out all those stresses from our high voltage. And you don't want to actually touch your semiconductor layer, because your semiconductor layer will embed itself inside the insulation, and we don't want that. So it looks pretty good now. We can actually open up our sardine can. And these are just pre-soaked cleaning rags, so they're lint free. We don't want any cloth getting stuck to our insulation here. And you also don't want to touch your semiconductor layer with these cleaning wipes. It'll actually pull the semiconductor, some of the coating off. And we'll just give it some nice little cleaning here. Make sure we get the whole thing. And we'll just give it a few seconds to evaporate before we actually apply our cold shrink. So our next step, we're going to start with our cold shrink. This red binder is just for shipping, so we need to remove this right away. And I usually wait until the last minute, because that will actually help with expanding this and prevent it from actually shrinking down prematurely. So now I'll actually pre-prep our cord so that it's close to the edge. And we'll slide it over. And remember, this is our indicator tape, so we want this cold shrink to start right at that indicator tape. And I always start a little past the tape, because it's way easier to pull this back once it started shrinking than it is to push it forward. If you try to push it forward, it's going to wrap under itself, and it's going to be a bit of a nightmare. So we're just going to unwrap counterclockwise, pulling at the same time. And it's just starting to shrink down, so I want to make sure it starts in the right spot. And we can see right there, it's lined up right on the edge of our tape line. And I'm just going to hold it here while I start actually shrinking it. We can see it shrinking down on itself as we pull it. You don't want to pull the body while you're actually shrinking it, because it'll stretch it. You'll end up with extra here, and it's not going to look right. Also, you can stretch it over the binder wire, and it's going to make it much more difficult to pull this zip cord out. And we can see it's just shrinking itself as we pull it. And no pressure pulling from this side down, just keeping it nice and tight on the back side where it's already shrunk. And the last little bit should just shoot out. And there we can see it's going to slowly shrink this down over the next 5-20 minutes When we come back, this will actually be tightened right down onto our compression lugs. And that's our 3M cold shrink high voltage installation.